Well, good evening and welcome to this special week at Central Seminary. I'm so glad that you all have joined us, whether you're on Zoom or on Facebook Live. We are so glad to have you a part of this special celebratory week. On my first day as president of Central Seminary, Jim Cook, the chair of the Central Board, came by our building to welcome me to my new role. Jim, who is ever kind and always insightful, knew that my beginning as president of Central during the midst of a global pandemic would have some unique challenges. And he was especially mindful that there might be a disconnect for me with the greater Central community. So I remember that conversation, and in it we agreed on that first day to put off a conversation about an inauguration for a few months when all would be well and the pandemic would be over. We all know how that ended up. But we decided to wait to plan a beautiful celebratory in-person event when COVID-19 was over. Now, Central was already far along in its embrace of virtual learning, and Zoom was not a new thing for us in the beginning of the pandemic, but hosting meaningful, sacred, memorable gatherings for large groups of people, that was still new territory for the seminary, and it seemed easier just to put off an inauguration. But then in my third month at Central, my pastor friend, Courtney Allen Crump, asked me several questions. She said, "What would you do differently if you knew that COVID-19 would be with us even until next year? How would that influence your plans, your hopes, and your leadership?" And with those words, I allowed myself to move forward with thinking about a presidential inauguration and considering the ways that it would be meaningful and special for the Central community and for me. So with thanks to Courtney, while still in the hard days of COVID-19, we kick off a week of events and gatherings. We begin tonight with a lecture from our special guest, Dr. Frank Yamada. Tomorrow afternoon, we will host a panel discussion with three amazing theological educators. And on Thursday night, we will have our inauguration service, which will be streamed on Zoom and on Facebook Live. And on Friday night, there are 5 Zoom after parties. So it's going to be a full week of learning and celebrating and sharing this special time of life together as a Central community. And we will be doing that in safe ways. So welcome, my friends, to Inauguration Week. Tonight, I am delighted to introduce to you Dr. Frank Yamada, who is Executive Director of the Association of Theological Schools. He is our inauguration lecturer. He has served with ATS as Executive Director since July 2017. And as most of you know, ATS is one of Central's accrediting bodies. So it's a great honor to have him join with us in this week of inauguration events. First, just a few words about ATS. More than 270 graduate schools of theology in the United States and Canada form the Association of Theological Schools. It's an organization that promotes formal education for ministerial leadership, and its member schools offer post-baccalaureate professional and academic degree programs to educate people who are called to ministry, whether in congregational ministry or in other services and ministries, or perhaps to research and teach in theological disciplines. In June 2020, under Dr. Yamada's leadership, the ATS Commission membership overwhelmingly adopted new standards of accreditation. That followed a 2-year process of rethinking and reimagining those standards with the membership in its constituencies. Those new standards became effective on July 1, 2020, and are principle-based and focus on educational quality, accreditation clarity, and contextualized flexibility. Dr. Yamada's good leadership of ATS, for that we are most grateful. We're also grateful for his long-term commitment and service to the Academy. Prior to his work with ATS, he served from 2011 to 2017 as the 10th president of McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago. He joined the faculty there in 2008 as Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible and Director of the Center for Asian American Ministries. His tenure at McCormick was marked by increasing diversity in the student population and creative engagement with the shifting realities of theological education. Prior to his time at McCormick, he taught Hebrew Bible and Old Testament for 9 years at Seabury Western Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois. He is an active biblical scholar and has authored and edited books and articles on cross-cultural and feminist hermeneutics. A graduate of Southern California College, Dr. Yamada earned his MDiv and his PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary. He's an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA, and his topic tonight, the futures of ministry and theological education, has become a great area of interest for him, and he has written and researched and addressed this topic often. And we are eager tonight to hear him speak and to hear what he has to teach us about our futures together at Central. I would ask that if you have questions that bubble up in the midst of his lecture, you would type them into the chat or share them on the Facebook comment section. And at the end, we'll have a time for question and answer, and I will read those questions. So go ahead and put those in as they come to your mind. But now we welcome and are delighted to hear from Dr. Yamada as our guest lecturer for Inauguration Week.
Thank you, Dr. Durso, President Durso. It is my privilege to be here on this grand occasion and this more frequent occasion of being on these remote spaces as schools participate in their own educational missions, but also in doing their events that many schools do throughout their academic year. So members of the Board of Trustees, President Durso, the administration, faculty, students, alums, and friends of Central Baptist Theological Seminary, I bring my welcome from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and from the Association of Theological Schools. I wanted to extend thanks to the Reverend Dr. Pamela Durso for the invitation to address all of you this evening on this particular topic, to what are we called, the futures of ministry and theological education. It is truly a privilege to address all of you within the Central Baptist Theological Seminary community on this grand occasion, as you will formally recognize Dr. Durso on Thursday as the seminary's 11th president at this series of inauguration events. So as a way of introducing this lecture, I actually went back through some of the presentations that I've given over the past few years to ATS schools, dozens and dozens of ATS schools on the topic of the changing nature of theological education and of the changing ways in which ministry is changing in the context of the church and outside of the church. So in preparation for this panel, I revisited a number of these presentations on the future of futures of theological education. So there are three dominant themes that I actually saw in these presentations as I looked over them. The first is that I really privileged the use of the plural futures. And that's really intentional rather than the singular future when broaching topics such as this, when looking for what is on the horizon in the future of theological schools. The use of the plural is intentional and consistent with the data that we sift through and interpret at ATS. There are multiple futures because theological schools are diverse, emerging from just as a diverse set of ecclesial traditions. There are multiple futures because the students who attend theological schools are increasingly diverse and are becoming even more so in terms of race, ethnicity, tradition, stage of life, and hopes for ministry. The futures of ministry and of theological education are multiple, and therefore I use the plural, futures. Therefore, my caveat from the beginning is that there really is no secret sauce that will magically deliver Central or any other seminary into a sustainable and vibrant future. There is no one-size-fits-all solution for the future of theological schools, because the future is actually futures. It is a multiple set of futures that theological schools will invest in going forward. I think Central's task will be to figure out what their pathway within those multiple futures is, and what is the most sustainable and vibrant pathway to carry on Central's mission. What we are learning from working at what we at the office call the 30,000-foot level of theological schools at the association is the best path for a school. And this is what we've come to learn, is the best path for a school is for it to know its mission and how to innovate to address the current context of change that faces higher education more broadly and theological schools more specifically. And even in even more of a broader sense, the health of religious communities more broadly, because as I will argue, that all of these components are interconnected. So the second major theme that I saw all across these presentations is the theme of change. In my first year as executive director of ATS, I went on a listening tour in which I met with various personnel, and I ended up meeting in that first year personnel from 86% of the almost 280 ATS schools. What the prevailing theme that was on the lips of almost every president, dean, faculty, and staff person was how deeply and profoundly their schools were changing. Schools are changing in their organizational and financial models. Schools are changing in their modes of education and in the student bodies of that theological schools are serving. In other words, in almost every aspect of a theological school's mission and in the execution of its educational mission, there are significant changes. And these are all changes that were happening before the onset of the twin pandemics of the coronavirus and COVID-19 disease and the systemic racism that emerged and was put front and center in the spring and summer of 2020 with the killing of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and many more Black lives. And that stirred and eventually stirred racial awakenings and protests this past spring and summer. Theological schools were already in a state of rapid and profound change. The last several months have only amplified the need and urgency for schools to adapt and change to these environments. In a recent article that has gone almost viral throughout the business and Christian nonprofit world, Andy Crouch, Kurt Kielhacker, and Dave Blanchard make a provocative claim actually in the very title of their article. The title of their article is "Leading Beyond the Blizzard: Why Every Organization is Now a Startup." The article was written only a few weeks into the pandemic, but their article puts a compelling face to the changes that many organizations are currently facing, especially in light of the global pandemic. And let me just offer a quote from that article. And I'm quoting here. "In this essay, we will explain why we think that for most organizations, businesses, nonprofits, and even churches, this is a time to urgently redesign our work in light of what we believe is not just a weeks-long blizzard, not even just a months-long winter, but something closer to the beginning of a 12 to 18th month ice age in which many assumptions and approaches must change for good. Almost all of us can and should keep the first 3 or 4 slides in our vision slide deck. However, everything else needs to be reevaluated," end quote. So this is a compelling metaphor and a timely call. The phrase used in the article is actually that of a mini ice age. And it refers to some events that have actually happened in terms of the climate earlier in earlier centuries, where, for example, at the turn of, I believe, of the 19th century, there was a volcanic eruption that actually disrupted an entire summer, and it was actually called, in some countries, a year without a summer. Now, if we apply this metaphor to theological schools, schools should not just be looking to endure a weeks-long blizzard or even a months-long winter. The enrollment and financial data from schools support that a short-term bump in enrollment is, and this is really what we've been seeing from the early returns on the data that we receive from ATS schools on enrollment, that the short-term bump in enrollment is what the majority of ATS schools faced in 2019, 2020, is there was actually an increase. A majority of ATS schools actually saw increases in enrollment over the past year. This combined with federal relief programs helped schools to ride out the blizzard and winter of this global pandemic financially. So in some ways, we're able to, many of the ATS schools were able to experience a little bit of a reprieve, even in the middle of this global pandemic. So we are now a year into this pandemic, and there are clearly longer term effects that emerge from the deep and substantive changes that were already present among ATS schools prior to 2020. So I recognize that this is not the most hopeful note upon which to begin a presentation, but I do want to signal that I think there is hope and good, deep reasons for hope for theological schools. In fact, hope was the third dominant theme that I saw in my presentations too, and listening sessions with theological schools. I think you will also find hope in the different strands of change that I'm summarizing, I will summarize in just a few minutes. And ultimately, my conclusion ends on a note of hope, hope that lies at the root of our faith traditions. And eventually, I eventually have to come back to the Hebrew Bible. That is actually my first love as a scholar, was being a Hebrew Bible scholar. But I lay these things out in terms of these realities of change, because I also believe, like Jim Collins, that an organization's journey from good to great begins by confronting the brutal facts of your reality. And that's his phrase, the brutal facts of your reality. In order to carve out hope in a dramatically changing environment, leaders must do a sober assessment of the facts about their realities, about the facts of the industry in which they are located, about the facts of the environment of theological schools. So in that vein, I will lay out some of the ways that we see changes in theological schools and the students whom they serve before offering a few thoughts about the central topic for tonight, to what we are called the futures of ministry and theological education. So I wanted to begin with first an exercise. I've done this before in on-site presentations and face-to-face presentations. I don't think I've ever done this with a remote audience or virtual audience just yet. But what I'm going to ask you to do is to go ahead and close your eyes. Okay, I can't see if all your eyes are closed, so we're just going to have to use the honor principle here. So go ahead and close your eyes. And I want you to imagine and get an image in your head of a seminary student. I hope you have that image in your head and that you're seeing this person. So, and again, we don't have to use the Q&A or the comments section to get your responses to this, but I want you to be able to think cognitively about your own responses. And by answering the question, what did you see? Was it an image of a male, of a female, of, was it an image, was the image, of what race was the image in your head, of what ethnicity, what age, what generation? Did this person have tattoos? Did this person, was this person full ability or had other abilities? There's a whole bunch of different ways and images that might have come into your head. Now, why I want you to participate in that exercise is not so much to do some self-reflection on what your image is of maybe a seminary student or an ideal seminary student, but I want you then to think with me, if we were to conduct this exercise with someone 30 years ago or 40 years ago, what would have been some of the images of a student that would have emerged? And one could only guess that they would look very different than the images that we could have gathered if we were in a room and I could just ask for people's images. But I would imagine that the images that we would ask from someone who 30 years in the past or 40 years in the past would look very different than the image of a seminarian that was in your head or that was in your imaginations. I would guess that these images that all of you had were much more diverse. in terms of some of those categories of identity that I just named. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we talk about the current demographics of the students of theological education. But what I want to recognize is that this is a 30, 40-year period where we've seen some dramatic changes in the characters of student bodies within ATS schools, and what it means to be a seminary student. So as that exercise invites us then into the idea of how have theological schools changed, and this will be the context and the broader context that we investigate then, in what ways are the context of ministry changing and our ministry context changing as we go into the future. Let me first, before we even get at the ways in which theological schools are changing, suggest that there are actually broader vectors converging that are influencing these changes that we are seeing in theological schools, that we're seeing in congregations and in communities of faith in North America and in fact worldwide. So the Pew Survey has taught us much about the nuns and the duns, or the nuns or the non-affiliated. The fastest growing segment of religious or spiritually oriented people in the US are the non-affiliated, or those who choose not to be associated with any particular religious tradition. The nuns make up now of more than a fifth of the entire US population and 1/3 of young adults, those under the age of 30, also known as the millennial generation when the survey was done. And these numbers are growing. Now, I called the nuns religious or spiritually oriented people on purpose, because it would be a mistake to say that this heterogeneous group is predominantly secular or non-believing. In fact, 2/3 of the non-affiliated believe in God. More than 1/3 of them would say that they are spiritual, though not religious. And about 20% of them say they pray daily. That being said, there is certainly no indication that these folks will be lining up to be the next wave of Baptists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Evangelicals, or Roman Catholics anytime soon. Many churches, some successfully, but mostly not, have sought to reach out to this group of young people, but research indicates that they are not joiners of traditional religious institutions or communities. So here's a bit of a freebie as we, this is a freebie, meaning kind of one of my big takeaways that I think about the young adults who are these non-affiliated and who are also potential folks who may be pursuing ministry in the future, even if it's not in the traditional forms that we think. So here's the freebie. So many non-affiliated non-affiliated are indeed participating in religious institutions, churches, seminaries, faith-based nonprofits, but they likely will not show up on membership rolls or stewardship drive lists. So in order for them to be donors, we first have to give them good, steady employment. So the first freebie is this. My encouragement would be for schools and for seminaries, but also for congregations and communities of faith and faith-based organizations and those ministries that are practiced outside of the walls of the church, to give them work. Let them work, give them jobs at a livable wage. I think that this imperative is even more important given the current rate of unemployment that we're seeing in this country. This is one of the big challenges that I think that a lot of both external ministries and internal ministries to the church are going to be dealing with, is the fact that we have a population of folks who are really underemployed. So not on top of that, we put a tremendous load of debt on this generation's back and on the backs of their parents, all in the name of higher education, an education that used to lead to employment and productive citizenship. It's time to let them lead and to let them lead us. They very well could be, in the biblical sense, the next Joshuas, the next Calebs, the next Rahabs of this generation. The generation who looks on a land of promise and, unlike the previous generations, sees not giants, defeat and death, but a land flowing with milk and honey, a fulfillment of promise and not possession. A generation who sees who sees and even ignores the impassability of the walls erected around a city, and lets the revolutionary element pass in the secret of the night. It is a time to pass the torch, to hand the baton over to those who will anchor the next leg of this race. And here's a second freebie or piece of advice that I'm going to give, even though you haven't asked for it. Rather than falling back on our members-only model of religious practices and religious communities, why not join them? In many ways, the 21st century congregation is finding its voice again on the streets, in the public square, not in the pulpit or necessarily in the pews, but at the erected podium of a protest or in the walking mass of humanity that seeks a justice that is greater than our polarized political stalemate. If we want to partner with the future, we need to let them lead, even as we walk side by side with them, side by side, not necessarily in front, not pushing from behind, but side by side with them, witnessing to the legacies of faith that inform their march and inform the very values that they want to embody. If we want to be mentors and elders of a movement, we must serve with and not take charge. And then this generation will discover for itself the wealth of resources within our faith traditions that lend themselves to movement making, to live as the prophet Micah exhorts us, to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. All of these data point to a great and growing lack of confidence in religious institutions, even as religion continues to be a driving force in much of our political and social debates. Now, while religion is far from gone in the public sphere, and in fact, it's played a pretty significant role in the public sphere over the last several months, its role and its place in society has certainly changed. In the middle of the 20th century, the church was still a central place in both the town square and in the public eye. Pastors held positions of esteem in local communities and were looked to be voices of conscience and moral authority within the community. Recent surveys within the pew have suggested that that has really changed. Pastors are no longer seen as the trusted individuals and leaders that they once were. Parishioners would turn to them on matters of public politics, social, and family life in ways that many do not today. The church itself was seen as a place that held us together, the social glue of our existence. Today, church competes with many other social and recreational allegiances. There are many forces that led up to this growing distrust of religious institutions, and we don't have enough time tonight to unpack those forces. But these currents have a precedent. They have a rationale. They are real, and they are not going away anytime soon. And they affect all of us in the world of theological education, since the missions of our schools all seek to form leaders for the church and society. So here I'm describing the larger forces of generational change that are happening within our society. There are also forces of change in higher education. Larger forces of change within the church and the church's role in society, but there are also forces of change in higher education. The most obvious effect of these changes in higher education can be seen in the rising cost of education. Here's a personal example of my own. I had just finished just last year, or 2 years ago, I'm sorry, putting my last adult child through college. And I can tell you that the price of education has gone up dramatically from the time that I was in college. What used to be a retirement nest egg is now an adequate down payment on tuition. Recruiting was less discernment and is now less discernment and more of a marketing pitch, which included these pitch of plush apartments, which I think we used to call dorms. All of those buildings and the perpetual cranes that are erected on most campuses across the country come with a price tag. And those price tags require donors, and those donors need a fundraiser. And those fundraisers, at least at the typical Research One university, have large corporate-sized salaries. And as the cashier rings up the total in the grocery line of your higher ed experience, she says, your total comes to a lifetime of debt. So there is another force on the horizon in higher education, the impending decline in enrollments. The Atlantic ran an article a couple of summers back stating that the United States is running out of teenagers. Since 2010, total enrollments at degree-granting post-secondary institutions has declined from just over 21 million to 20 million, or just under 5%. The millennial bubble is complete, and the next generation on its heels is just not entering undergraduate school at the same kind of rate, which results in less demand for higher education, at least for now. When one couples this with the growing number of colleges, universities, and technical schools, it is not a stretch to assume that we are heading into a period of consolidation in higher education more generally. The decline is in the number of students attending undergraduate institutions will have an effect on all of graduate education, including graduate theological education. Now, I raise these larger vectors to point out that seminaries are at the intersection of these two forces of change between higher ed and the role of the church in society. This is why it should not surprise us when the dominant theme that we hear at all ATS schools is one of change. But there's something particular and unique about the changes that we are experiencing, though they emerge from these broader vectors of change within society and in higher education. So let me explore just some in a very summary fashion, the ways that we have seen theological schools changing. We are seeing changes in at least three ways. One, in the school structure or the model of the school or institution. Two, in the programs and delivery of those programs and the educational missions of those schools. And three, in the students these schools serve. So with regard to the school structure or model, we are seeing significant increases in the number of schools that are merging or embedding within larger contexts. For example, into a larger college or a university. Since 2010, there have been 28 schools, it could be between 28 and 29 schools that have engaged in merging or embedding. This number is about 10% of the ATS member schools within a 10-year period. Embedded schools now represent 45% of the membership. The current standards were written, the previous standards, were written with an independent freestanding school in mind. Increasingly, however, the image that one has in one's mind when one closes one's eyes and imagines a seminary of today is one of an embedded or school within a college or a university. That is increasingly the image that would come to mind for those who are theological schools. Now, this is not a prescription for the future of theological schools. Merging is not the answer for all schools. Merging and embedding is more likely the byproduct of an increasing number of schools serving a flat or decreasing number of students since 2005. The second way that schools are changing are in their programs and delivery. The Master's of Divinity degree has been relatively flat and has been declining over time, while there has been growth in the number of students who are taking professional and academic MA degrees. And in fact, we imagine that within the next couple to few years, MA degrees will surpass MDiv degrees in total numbers of students in ATS schools. Over 20 years ago, there were no schools offering online courses or degrees programs. Today, almost 2/3 of ATS schools have online courses, and over a quarter have completely online degree programs. However, distance learning only tells part of the story. Degrees and programs are increasingly moving to deeper engagement of a student's context. Schools have been engaged in, for example, competency-based education, where programs are developed after extensive surveys from churches and denominational leaders about what their leaders need from their education. Often a student is now using his or her current ministry context, not just as a site of learning, but the context itself has become the content through which the Bible, theology, ministry, and history is unpacked. This is a reversal of the traditional residential model of theological education, where the context had to be almost abstracted and imagined as the students were learning within a residential context of theological school. This is not to say that residential model is going away anytime soon. It is not. Schools, however, are paying much more attention to the costs and benefits of residential theological education. For example, schools that have committed themselves to this model are now asking the question of how to best leverage their campuses and in-person engagement to see what can students learn best in such environments. For example, what difference does it make to do theological education in St. Louis or in Chicago or in Los Angeles or in Pittsburgh? Of course, with the global pandemic, the vast majority of ATS schools are now doing some form of remote online delivery, and an increasing number of schools are looking to adapt the delivery of their educational mission for the long term. If you want to see a summary of just the incredible amount of creativity and diversity among the different educational models that schools are using, I would encourage you and direct you to ATS's website and look for the Educational Models and Educational Models and Practices project, which was a several-year project that we conducted for the Lilly Endowment that really tried to capture all of the different modes of education, the different practices that theological schools were now practicing within their educational mission. Just some examples of some of the groups that we convened in this Educational Models project include, for example, there was a group that was looking at online formation. Think about those two terms, and those two terms that would have never gone together just maybe 3 decades ago. Online formation and how that is being done in some schools. We had another group that was looking at seminary in the context of prisons. We had other groups that were looking at the best practices within international education and education among international students. We had competency-based education, a whole host of different groups and projects that were looking at the different educational practices and models of education within theological schools. If schools are changing in their financial and organizational models, in their educational models, they are also changing in their student bodies and in the student bodies whom they serve. So for the majority of the 20th century, the typical seminary student, now remember that image of the seminary student that you had that I asked you to think about in your own mind. For the majority of the 20th century, the typical seminary student was white, and these are based on data, was white, male, younger, full-time, residential, attending a school of the same denomination in which the student was raised. And the denomination or this person's local church supported that seminarian. The graduate would then go on to serve a church within that same denomination. So if that was the model of the 20th century student, the 21st century student is basically take all of those categories and change them. So the 21st century student is increasingly a student of color, older, part-time, a local commuter or local resident, excuse me, attending a school that is not of his or her denomination and is already engaged in a local ministry context. The person is also usually the sole funder of his or her theological education. Another way to put these changes, students are increasingly less denominationally and more locally, geographically engaged with their seminary. This is why it is not uncommon for a Latino Pentecostal pastor to be trained at a mainline Protestant seminary, as an example. If we then think about if this is the changing nature of theological schools and what's going on in terms of the changing environments of theological schools, let's explore the changing vocations of ministry. We did a survey recently of ATS alums, and a lot of my information points come from those surveys. You can find articles on our website about these from our research team. If the structures, educational models, and student bodies of theological schools are changing, so too are the vocations in which seminary graduates are landing and serving. But the decentering of religious institutions in North America, which I described above, communities of faith are playing a diminished role in society. And for this reason, graduates of ATS schools are increasingly serving in more diverse contexts, both within and outside of the church. Recent survey of these, in this recent survey of ATS alums, it found that the plurality, or 41%, still do serve in congregational contexts. The majority, 59%, however, serve outside of congregations. Other places where ATS alums are serving include educational, places of educational formation or education, faith-related organizations, healthcare, for example, chaplains and counselors, community service organizations, or denominational administration. Competencies in these settings, the competencies that are required in these settings are also shifting and changing. In all of these settings, the competencies required for graduates to effectively serve is shifting. While a cluster of the top competencies would be recognizable in theological curricula and traditional congregational ministry settings, there are an increasing number of competencies that reflect this diversified set of ministry contexts. For example, the most frequently named competency listed in the survey of these alums, the skill that they required the most in their current jobs, was that of administration. While administration is certainly a significant part of congregational leadership, its place at the top of listed competency represents a shift in emphasis for religious leaders. Along with competencies such as spiritual disciplines, theology, pastoral care, and finance, and counseling and preaching, alums also named things like interpersonal competency, finance, conflict resolution, intercultural competency, active listening, and having and hosting difficult conversations. This set of shifting competencies demonstrates the changing landscape of the leadership needs required from these different contexts of ministry. And yes, I'm using that term intentionally. These are contexts of ministry. This is seen not only in the ways that the alums view these contexts, but if we look at another example of what the alums originally went to seminary for, they went to do it to fulfill some sense of a ministry calling. What we see in terms of where they're landing is not just the changing nature of the way the ministry is changing, but the different ways in which that alums are seeking to live out their vocations within these different contexts. So let me offer a few modest conclusions, a few modest offerings for the future of ministry and theological education. In closing, first of all, I think one of the things that we hear as a theme, I think this is a theme that has only been amplified by the global pandemic. Both theological schools and the context in which alums are now serving are environments that require the nurturing of both of legacy and of innovation, of strengthening the mission and fostering, of strengthening the mission of an organization, and helping organizations foster innovation so that they can better accomplish those historical missions. So this is not only for theological schools, it is indeed the entire ecology of the church and ministry. Indeed, one could argue that we are experiencing titanic shifts in the institutional organization of North American society, and that this need for both strengthening our legacies of what institutions have done and what they have brought forward and how they have nurtured and helped support society, but not only those legacies, but the ways in which these things need to be innovated. So nurturing environments of both legacy and of innovation. There's also a theme that we've heard and that we hear among many ATS schools, connecting more deeply with congregations and contexts of ministry with congregations and contexts of ministry outside of congregations. What do these folks need from ministry and from leadership? What do leaders need to be equipped with to foster healthy change in places where they serve, inside and outside the church's walls? One of the things that we used to talk about this in our place at McCormick Theological Seminary. For many years, I think we thought of ourselves not so much as a recruitment office, but as an admissions office. We just received those who were applying. I think what we're finding is that there really needs to be a lot deeper engagement with the communities where our alums serve to find out what their needs are for leadership, and that these needs then therefore need to influence our decisions about curriculum and about what needs to be taught, and how we can develop avenues of formation for students. The third modest offering is that I think that we see a theme throughout these, both in the educational models that schools are developing, but also in the needs that we hear from theological students, and that is the focus on formation. Dan Ailshar has argued that theological education is undergoing its third significant shift in emphasis and identity. From early models of a learned clergy and apprenticeship model to the model that dominated most of the 20th century, the professional model of religious leadership, this third major shift, which we are currently living in, is the shift to formational theological education. Now, as I said before, what we've seen from the Pew survey is that there is a large decrease of trust that's placed in religious leaders. And a lot of that has to do with both the ethical and moral formation of those leaders. While we have tended to emphasize the theological formation, Dan would argue that we also need to be paying attention to moral and the ethical and the human formation of leaders, something that, of course, many religious traditions have paid attention to and many theological curricula pay attention to. But this emphasis on formation seems to be a big shift. Now, this formation is not just kind of a formation in an ideal construct. It is formation within context. The different ways that students are being formed is done in so many varied contexts that those formations are going to have to actually be tailored to those contexts and to the students' needs within those contexts. So seminaries are connecting more deeply with local congregations and church judicatories to form the leaders required to serve in changing environments. And I would also argue that we need to begin to break down the distinction between the inside and outside of the walls of the church mentality and focus on how the church serves in the world, so that we can also equip and form those who intend to serve outside of the walls of the church, whether in nonprofit organizations or in the context of healthcare, like as in chaplains or in counselors, or in other ministry contexts that are outside the walls of the church. And finally, the fourth theme, themes that I think resonate both within theological education and in the ministry of how to lead creatively through Christ, and theological education and within ministry, of how to lead creatively through crisis. One of the things that we've heard from leaders during the COVID-19 global pandemic is how schools have not only coped with the crisis, but how there has been an increased openness to innovation, bursts of surprising creativity, long-held kind of stalemates between faculty and administration about, for example, the use of online education were just blown open through the pandemic. And I think faculty and administrators have found a renewed creativity as they think of different ways to deliver their theological education. And I think one of the good news pieces here, again, for Central Baptist is Central Baptist has been a school that has long already engaged in distance learning and distance learning in intercultural contexts, which has been really a hallmark of Central's growth over the past decade. This dynamic between creativity and crisis should not be new to us as people of faith. From the very beginning in Scripture, creation emerges not in spite of, but in the middle of chaos. Think of the opening words of the Hebrew Bible. In the beginning, Bereshit, in the beginning, when the earth was a formless void and darkness covered the face of the deep. The face of the deep and darkness signals this chaos, this watery chaos, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. God brings order from the chaos, but God never eliminates it. The chaos in the form of water, waters above and waters below, is always still there, but now it is ordered. God does not save creation from chaos. God creates in the midst of chaos and orders it. God's hands shape the creative and chaotic power of water to produce life. In fact, one of the prevailing contexts in which most of Scripture was written was in the context of some crisis for the people of God. The exilic and post-exilic periods were the most creative literary periods in Israel's history, and really gave birth to what became for Protestants or for Christians, the Old Testament. The entire New Testament is written within the context of a minority Jewish Messianic religious tradition that was trying to cope and wrestle with the idea of the recent destruction of the Second Temple. Creation and chaos, creativity and crisis, these two things go hand in glove. This may be part, in fact, of our dynamic DNA of what it means to be the people of God. Now, what I think is really the next steps for Central to think about is how that creativity can happen and emerge in the middle of this crisis, not just this global pandemic, but this dynamic changing environment that we are experiencing in the broader context of the US. What are the narratives and the stories of this change and the next chapters that Central wants to write? And that is your big question, and that is your work. So I thank you for this time, and I am now opening up for some time of questions.
Thank you, Dr. Yeoman. That was just a wonderful presentation, and I had so many questions that I have for you, but we have other questions from some of our students and professors, and I'll read those first. And one of our students in South Carolina asked a question about the demand for MDivs, why the demand is decreasing and MA demand is increasing, and she wonders if that's due to the length of the program or what one can do with a degree, and what do you see the reasoning for that?
I think there are a number of factors. One, you actually, this person, the questioner, actually named a couple of them. One is, I do think that there is something about the idea that the MAs tend to be shorter degree programs, right? They're not 3-year. Well, and again, when we think 3-year MDiv program, that's not the reality. The reality is that most students take about 4.5 to 5 years to complete an MDiv, which means it's an added expense. So that is part of it. I don't think that's the only reason. I think another reason is that it has something to do with the changing demographics of students. An increasing number of students are coming from traditions that don't require the MDiv as a certification degree. And because of that, they prefer the MA degree as their degree of choice. And many of those students are then using those MA degrees, whether it's an academic MA degree or professional MA, as their kind of education for ministry, and it's their ongoing formation for the ministry context that they're usually already serving. So those are two big factors of that change. And I think it will be just a couple of years before we begin to see that the master's degree, MA degree, actually surpasses the MDiv degree. Now, that being said, the MDiv degree is still a very, very well populated degree. So that, the MDiv is not going away anytime soon. But I think what it does reflect is that these changing demographics and the changing needs of students.
We have another question from one of our professors, Dr. Roselle. He says, thank you for a fascinating description and analysis of theological education. Is there data indicating relative percentages of seminary graduates who go into congregational ministries versus chaplaincy or nonprofit leadership or international missions or lay or secular work as compared to previous decades that we have information about?
I think we could gather those data. I think it would not be the same sample because the data, the percentages that I shared, and those percentages would actually say, I think I quoted those percentages of recent ATS alums, and those that were surveyed, 41% are serving in congregational context, 59% are serving outside of the context of congregations. I could give a full list, but it's not hard to use your imagination to look at some of the list of those professions, and many of them would be counted as ministries in some context of church. As just a personal example, I was ordained in the Presbyterian Church USA, though I was not in a context of ministry, and that's one of the requirements for ordination. But my presbytery ordained me to the context of specialized ministry, which was teaching at a seminary. That's what I saw my ministry as. That's just a personal example, but I think when you look at the list of vocations, teachers, educators, working at nonprofits or social justice ministries, working as social workers in service of communities, many of the graduates would consider this to be forms of ministry. And in some ways, what needs to happen is the churches really need to catch up with and the denominations need to catch up with the idea of what it means to be serving in the context of ministry.
Thank you. So Dr. Pendleton on our faculty asked this question. He said, I'm interested in the concept of the formational model of theological education. I see how different it is from the 20th century professional model that I myself am a product of, but wonder about its differences with the earlier medieval and early modern apprenticeship model that you also mentioned. Isn't the formational model closer to the earlier one of apprenticeship?
Yeah, and I think I would agree with that. And I would also, I appreciate the caution of making some harsh binaries between the apprenticeship model, the professional model, because in some ways, apprenticeship, that was a form of formation, right? You were alongside of a mentor who walked you through the process of what it meant to be ministry. Within the Roman Catholic tradition, seminary is often seen as emphasizing, for example, the educational formation of an individual. So these really are not harsh binaries, but I think the emphasis is really increasingly being placed on formation and the formational character and the role that theological education plays in the formation of future leaders and current leaders. So I think that's a really good, sharp distinction. That's a good way to frame it, that there's not such a harsh distinction. And I would agree that in some ways we are reverting back to earlier forms of ministry formation. Because I think one of the things that I think schools are wrestling with is what's tied up to the professional formation is the fact that, we're a professional graduate school. So we're not going to get out of that business anytime soon, but there is an element where we are seeing an increased role of formation in the context of students. And that formation takes on a whole bunch of different characters and tones. It can be both moral and ethical formation in large cases, because a lot of current students don't have the religious formation growing up. Many of them did not grow up in the congregations of their parents. And many came to faith later in some ways. So their religious formation is also a piece that seminaries are beginning to participate much more in. And one last little word on the formation component. I think that really does suggest that we are in an era of formational theological education. When we did a similar survey that we did with alums, we did with faculty. And we looked at the changing nature of faculty work. What we found wouldn't surprise many of you. Most faculty were formed to be first scholars, and scholars that really responded to their guilds and their disciplines. But increasingly in certain generations as well, we began to see also the elements of teaching, and they see their vocation as a teacher and a scholar. But increasingly in this last survey, we saw two other components that really rose up in terms of the kind of work that faculty are doing. And those two other components are administration. So very much parallel to what we're seeing with our alums, and formation of students. So increasingly faculty are participating in, for example, oversight of a degree program, or of assessment, or or running a center. So there's an administrative component, but there's also an increasing number of faculty who are spending much more time in doing the formation of students. So, and just the final quick footnote on that is that increase in the faculty also surveyed said their doctoral formation and their current institutions do a relatively good job of supporting their scholarship and their teaching, not as good of a job in supporting their work in administration or in formation.
Well, we have one more question and this will be the final one, that comes from Dr. Park on our faculty. He writes, Alan Roxburgh and Mark Branson state in their upcoming book, Leadership, God's Agency and Disruptions. And the quote is, therefore, one of the critical practices to be cultivated is that of how we pay attention to what God is already doing ahead of us. Discernment is more critical than innovation. And his question is, how do you exercise discernment as to what needs to be changed and abandoned and what needs to be initiated? What kind of discernment process does your institution go through?
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there, because there's a lot of concepts that we're drawing from the two authors, of which I'm familiar. And in some ways, they're trying to make a case against innovation. And I think my point of view of this would be that I think innovation, as we learn of it, innovation has really become a buzzword in business circles and higher education. But another way to think of innovation is really as faithful change. The way that I tend to also like to think of innovation is theologically speaking. So but this is something that I really learned from missiologists, is that I'm in big agreement that, in some ways missiology is not about going, we are the bearers of God's mission and God's message, and we need to send it out to the world. It's more about going out into the world to hear what God is up to. And I think that a Christian sense of innovation is very similar. We have to understand that theology and anthropology have to go hand in hand with innovation. Innovation isn't just an invention that humans create. It's a way to listen to where the Spirit's moving and figuring out how we indeed can be adapt to that innovation that the Spirit is already moving in, or how we can indeed be reformed, or even converted. I use both of those terms intentionally. I'm a Presbyterian minister who had an evangelical background. I think there's both a sense in which, as I read scripture, for example, in the book of Acts, it really is the church that needs to be converted to the mission of God. It's not that the church is, think about what happens in Acts chapter 10. It takes the falling of the Spirit on the Gentiles for the church to go, oh, maybe we should pay attention to what's going on here. And then the church begins to think about, okay, let's think about what this means in terms of how God is working and what this means for the mission of the church. So my response theologically would be that I think in some ways innovation is really that creative impulse that helps us to adapt to the realities that God has put in front of us.
I appreciate your good answers to these questions, and I have so many more, but I have your email address, so I may be emailing you with my questions. But we've come to our time, and I want to honor that. But I'm so thankful for your spending a Tuesday night with our central community, and for your wise words and your freebies that we've all taken away from this. I've wrote down in my notebook, freebies from Frank. So we'll keep those with us and keep in mind your words of wisdom as we move forward together as a community. And they're so appreciative of the work you do with ATS and the ways in which you empower schools like ours to do good work in God's world. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I look forward to more time together in the future, and maybe in-person meetings in which we'll all be a part come down the road. So, but thank you all for joining us tonight, and thank you, Dr. Yamada, for your good lecture and for making us think more broadly about things that we need to pay attention to. And with that, I will say good night, and hope to see many of you tomorrow at 1 o'clock as we have our panel discussion. And then on Thursday night at 7 o'clock at the the service that will be both on Facebook and on Zoom. So thank you so much. Good night.